All right. Hello, everybody. We're gonna have a dialogue. I'm sorry. What was that?
No, I was just saying hello.
Oh yes, yes. I have a guest here to have a dialogue with, and I figured we would talk about what it means to have faith. What is God all about? And I'm particularly interested in what's going on with the book you authored. Unfortunately, I didn't. I have so many books on my reading list, but I wanted to get like a first person perspective, and I watch a lot of podcasts and lecture videos, and the best way I learn is audio visual. So I have problems with reading comprehension due to the autism, but I figured I'd get like kind of like a first hand account on like what your direction is in terms of your views on Judaism, like what's Zionism all about, because I'm having an understand Judaism and Zionism. But first, I guess I'll let you introduce yourself. Then I can introduce myself, and then we'll start from first principles. We'll try and talk about what does God mean to you? What does it mean to have faith? And then I'll give my points of view, and then we'll jump right into Judaism and Zionism. So tell us what you're all about. Like, what are you trying to do? And let's go from there.
Hello everyone, my name is Enes. I am an author, and this is part of, I guess, a posture in my life to try and seek truth and confront what I would say is the maybe rampant nihilism of modernity. And my sort of beginning with writing, my sort of entry into the world of philosophy was my own confrontation with nihilism. And so I'll get into this later, but my wider study of Judaism is part of this sort of mapping of modernity, mapping of modern thinking. And I think everything really, and this will get into the idea of faith, I think much of religion is a response to nihilism. And I'm not giving this like a biological perspective, like from a true faith perspective, that when we live in this world, we're able to abstract ourselves and we're able to look up and we're able to sort of question on existence, right? To live is sort of to question, to live is sort of to ask why. And the immediate result of asking why is, it's the question of purpose and meaning and existence. And perhaps the question of existentialism has been around for much longer than what a modern course in continental philosophy would display. But the idea is that in a life that is full of suffering and an inevitable death, where do we derive our purpose? Where do we derive our meaning? Is there such a thing as purpose within and meaning within the suffering? And that's sort of what is alluring about Judaism, is that there is this narrative and this history of unparalleled, perhaps, suffering and persecution across a wide expanse of history, yet there's a persistence and a survival and a continuance of this group. And how is that possible? And it's sort of a broader narrative that fits into our own lives. And so for me, faith, it's a great question. It's a great question. And I was having this talk with my dad the other day. He was talking about atheism and whatnot. And he's religious, but he's making these like sort of claims and whatnot in line with like evolutionary biology and whatnot. That we have rationality and science and logic, but truthfully, atheism is just as much as a faith claim as theism. That you have to actually have faith that there is no such thing, that there is no God, because we can't prove it unequivocally. In fact, as humans, we're unable to prove anything really. If you go into a broader study of mathematics, you'll discover this with reading about the opinions of famous mathematicians themselves. Right? There's Kurt Gödel who has Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Right? Gödel believed in God, and you have all these other sort of elements of mathematics that display to us that there is something transcendental, that there is some sort of presupposition that we take for granted, that we take to be true, that underlies mathematics and logic and all of these things. And sort of one of the blunders, perhaps, of the Enlightenment was that there was a belief, there's a retention of rationality and logic, but no questioning of, say, the presuppositions or axioms that were founding logic and rationality. And what do I mean? Well, we can get into that later, but I guess the broader point I'm trying to say is that we have faith
in really everything in life. And so what I've discovered is that that there is sort of something universal about our existence. There is something beautiful that exists amidst sort of maybe the mud and the dirt. And I guess here's sort of an analogy is like we as humans, we're sort of like geologists perhaps. And some of us dig and we find nothing but mud and dirt and sort of maybe filth, right? Human greed and all of these other things and envy. Some of us dig a little deeper and we discover rocks and various kinds of rocks. And we discover this game of power and hierarchy and all these things. But if you keep on digging, if you keep on going through the darkness and you just keep on going deeper and deeper, eventually you find gold, you find silver, you find diamonds, you find something beautiful about human existence, and the just existence of that transcends the subjective experience. I have faith in that transcendental. I have faith in that higher good, in that idea of purpose and redemption and meaning in our lives. And I think it's impossible to live without that faith. And God represents the peak of all beauty, the peak of all truth, the peak of all that is good in life. And orienting yourself towards that transcendental ideal as a pathway to meaning.
Sure. Yeah. That was quite an interesting introduction.
That was a long one. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, it's all right. I have a habit of going right into what I want to talk about and cover, and the point of view I have.
Yeah.
But I also want to. I'm assuming a lot of people listening in on this at some point after I put the recording up on YouTube are going to wonder, who is this guy having this dialogue with this other guy? And to elaborate on more who I'm all about, basically what I'm trying to, I'm working on a series of publications on habits and adaptive learning. So this is in the cognitive sciences of understanding how we engage with the world around us, and like how can we adapt to circumstance and optimize our being, and how we engage with our environment and each other and all that. What are interventionary approaches that we can leverage that? But in the context of investigating that, what I'm broadly trying to do is I look at a lot of literature. I have like about 1,000 papers to work with for the series of publications I'm working with. A few hundred of them I only work through the abstracts, but one of my problems is I find so much information, and it's like, okay, I could be consumed in looking at the information and not really making progress with throwing my insights together. Or if I have enough content to work with, it's like, all right, I got this content, let's make sense of the criteria, or like the literature I find, or what I call the information criteria, and okay, is there data out there that helps us use the criteria to evaluate like what's happening around us. And sorry, my mom was asking. Sorry. So on the one hand, we have, so what I do is I collect the literature, academic literature primarily, on evaluating information criteria. What can tell us a story that is not just a general, as you mentioned about Gödel and the problem with having an absolute understanding of the world around us, which boils down to ultimately being relative. I would think that we similarly agree with that to some degree anyway. So on the one hand, it's important to see what is said about the data and what data we find and how we can make sense of the data. So collecting the data and having methods and models to evaluate that data is also part of what I'm trying to do, building complex systems models. So thinking about complex systems, one of the best examples is molecular biology, where you take the functions of biology and the functions of chemistry and you try and make sense of what that means and how that can better explain phenomena happening around us. But mostly it's taking like different systems with different functions, seeing how they function jointly or disjointly, or how they interact with each other, that enables other phenomena to occur, and how that happens at scale. So trying to build complex systems models and models with data, and evaluate information criteria, and focus on problem domains that to evaluate with that. With the consensus of this criteria, converging viewpoints, and taking what the data means and building models to make sense of that and the criteria. And so I would describe what I do as like a generalist analyst point of view, like not like a specialist, but like I focus a lot on developing a foundation in mathematics to do what I'm doing, especially working with complex systems. But basically, I consider myself some kind of analyst that's trying to make a career out of evaluating information, criteria, and data, and building models, and then putting out insights about what that means and where we can go with that evaluation, like making predictions. But anyway, a little bit of an elongated.
That's fine. Actually, if I could add some things there or ask some questions real quick.
Yes.
It seems like sort of what you're talking about too is maybe modeling the functioning of the human brain, because a lot of what parsing information about the world, complex things, interrelating them, generating models, and then when new information arises, sublating that model within a new model.
Sure.
Right. That seems like in some ways you're sort of investigating and trying to develop a model of how the brain models the world. Right.
Yes.
That's great. That's great.
And I think what's interesting about life, I don't know if you've heard of, you're familiar with Enes Cakir from DeepMind. And one of the key brains behind AlphaFold. I think we all know AlphaFold, AlphaGo, and AlphaZero. He's worked on that stuff, and he's part of Google. And he said he said that life is the universe becoming increasingly more aware of itself.
Yep.
But Lee Cronin, I don't know if you're familiar with Leroy.
Yeah. I think so.
Cronin, the guy who works on assembly theory, which I think there's so much we can do with assembly theory, especially like understanding what God and faith means. Like you could take assembly theory, also the free energy principle, which I don't know how much time we have to talk about stuff like the free energy principle and Carl Friston and colleagues' work. But there's a lot of great stuff out there on agential systems that has to do. I have an agential systems point of view on understanding what God means. But what I was getting at too, Lee Cronin said. So on the one hand, Enes Cakir says that life is the universe becoming increasingly more aware of itself because of the capacities of agency. While on the other hand, Lee Cronin said life is the universe trying to store memory of itself, like generate instances of like this idea of being able to have things within the universe that better understand and store information about interactions happening around these things. I mean, he didn't. What he said is life itself is, or we could think about DNA and like the capacities of DNA and whatnot, is the capacity to store memory of itself. But I think when you join that with what the Enes Cakir says, wow, that's so incredible. I remember
one sort of seems like it's moving forward, the other seems like it's moving backwards. If that makes sense.
Well, I think they kind of just seems like they couple together pretty well. Like one doesn't fully explain what life is, but then when you bring them together, it's like really trippy to think about. It's like, whoa, like, what does it mean for the universe being able to store memory of itself while becoming increasingly more aware of itself? Like, what is the, like, will we truly understand what that means? But before I get into my point of view of what God means and how that connects with what faith is and what faith means, I guess you can elaborate more on like what does God mean to you, and how does that connect with having faith? Does God necessarily, is that a requirement to believe in God to have faith, or because atheism, I guess, can make some atheists, and I was an atheist for a very long time. So I could see atheists making the ethical argument of having faith but not believing in God. But I guess you can give a point of view on that. But I guess you could pick it up from there.
Yeah. So what does God mean to me?
Yeah, I guess what's your angle on God, and how does that connect us as human beings to the world around us and what have you?
Well, there's a number of things too. So for example, I'm holding up a pencil right here. Right? Why is this a pencil? Why? I guess I'll just ask that to you. Why is this a pencil?
I would say that we as like these organisms had the capacity to create this object using our capacities to cooperate with each other and develop technology. But I mean, I would say that gets into my lens of what God means, is like this optimized capacity to cooperate with one another and appreciate each other's agency in the world around us. And then like how does that unfold, in the sense that we optimize for being mindful of each other and how we engage with each other and what that can bring forward and how that unfolds.
Gotcha. And I'm like personally from the Abrahamic tradition, but I do have a broadened horizon view of conceptions of God and sort of various other syntheses. But with the question about you're talking about we as humans have this capacity to create, and part of what that means is that we have maybe an attribute of God within us, a divine attribute of God within us, the creative faculty that is what God is, right, as the creator. And this, right, this idea of a pencil, right, why is this a pencil? And I've discovered that there's really only two perspectives that are possible, like an etiological and teleological perspective or a relational perspective. And I suppose what I mean is that you can say that this is a pencil because there's a creator that created it as a pencil, right? And he has in his mind a certain function in mind for that pencil. But I can take this pencil and I use it as a pencil with the function that it has, that it was created and intended to be used for. But I can also use this as a weapon. I could use it to stab somebody. I could use it as a projectile. I could use it for a number of things. And so the identity of the pencil, where does it come from? Is its identity relational to me, subject, object? Or is there some notion of a creator that gives it its teleos? And so it's a fundamental question, I think, that really undergirds everyone's understanding of reality. And when we think about other individuals as well, is someone an individual only insofar as I can relate to them as an individual, or are they an individual no matter what my subjective orientation is to them, right? And so this idea of the dignity of the human being, the equality of all human beings in their agencies, in the fact that they exist. And so for me, obviously, I take a God from the Abrahamic tradition and this notion of creation and the idea of a more biblical notion of morality. But I think that at the same time that God represents maybe the solution or the answer to the problem of humanity, or the dialectic of suffering and particularity and universality, and that he represents that universal concept, the transcendental universal concept. And that in my own investigation of modernity and modern thinking, I've come to see that even with, say, an atheist or a secular person, that there still is a retention and maybe an inability to abandon. You can maybe abandon the form and image of God as he has existed historically, but you cannot abandon the idea that God represents, right, as this abstract universal, and this maybe human prerogative of striving for something greater. Because even if we look at sort of maybe a very atheistic political perspective, there's always and there still remains a notion of progress towards some better end, some morally more righteous or politically more free or more equal end. And these conceptions of universality, right, they're sort of replacing conceptions of God. I'm going more into like a modern thing, but I guess I don't want to actually answer for too long. But yeah, to me, God represents the creator, the purpose giver, the transcendental universal that the humans are directed towards, that gives us meaning and structure, not necessarily structure, but meaning in our lives. And he represents sort of, so you said life is the universe becoming more aware of itself.
And storing a memory of itself.
Right, and then storing a memory of itself. Yeah. And perhaps religion, canonically, can be considered the latter part, right, storing a memory of itself. and the former is us coming to a more realization of God, right? And because God is the ultimately aware and ultimately self-aware being. And so, in that conception, there's a lot of other things too. But anyways, and then was there a second part of that question?
I think you've gone over quite a bit there in terms of talking about creator. So my point of view on God, and mind you, I was an atheist for a very long time. So I guess
I was an atheist for a few years as well.
I was an atheist I'm 34 now. I was 33 when I guess my point of view changed to more of, I guess, a deist point of view.
Deist, yeah.
But my idea of God came from understanding what you brought up as teleos, which even though I understand what you meant, maybe people listening might want a better explanation, so I'll give them that explanation from my point of view, and you can elaborate on that if you want. But teleos has to do with this idea of goal-directed behavior, which guides agency. And I would say God is the essence of how we direct our agency based on the degrees of freedom we have.
Yeah.
Especially as human beings, we have like this degree of autonomy because we're these complex systems of like multiple cells that, based on understanding agential systems, we're composed of multiple agents. So we're these multi-agent systems composed of multiple cells that are all interacting and engaging with each other with with much more simpler degrees of agency, of course, but that amalgamates to our degrees of agency. And in a phenomenal way, it's like, wow, like all these cells are working together to maintain our being. And I would say in a phenomenal sense, not just ontologically. I think you make the case more so like, okay, like creator isn't this ontological depiction of like what God means in the essence of like having this nature of being with autonomy and guiding that sense of being with respect to how we ethically align with other agents. But building on that, like in the phenomenal sense, our the cells, the unit agents in our body, and cooperate to regulate the integrity of our agency, and then that gives us the capacity, the fundamental capacity to be able to make decisions because we have neural and glial cellular networks in our brains that engage with each other in a distributed processing manner in a lateral sense. Because no one region in the brain is doing a particular function. They're all working together. Like the hippocampus doesn't store memories and reference them on its own. It works with the amygdala, the thalamus, and other parts of the brain like the prefrontal cortex. So no one region of the brain is doing a specific function. They're all working together, and in this working togetherness, from this our capacity to maintain our own agency, and then that extends to how we are engaging with each other and how we recognize each other's agency, right? So I think of God as this phenomenal sense to appreciate each other's agency to the degree that we have the degrees of autonomy to be aware of, wow, we live in this world where we're aware of our own demise and how and like just what we're interacting with in a generalized sense because of limitations in knowledge due to Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Although there are, I would say we get insight from Gödel's incompleteness theorems in the sense that Gödel's incompleteness theorems are really built on looking at how do we map the axiomatization of arithmetic to the natural numbers based on the constraints that we develop when we do the one-to-one mapping. And then we find an inconsistency that forms a contradiction where you have, okay, this proof demonstrates that it is untrue, otherwise it's true. But if this proof is true, then it's not true. Right, so like you have this contradiction, like a true and false contradiction, based on a particular weird mapping you end up with trying to axiomatize the arithmetic with the natural numbers. So, and this is more so looking at functions of a closed system. So another problem with Gödel's incompleteness theorems is it doesn't really explain how open systems engage with each other when we consider the universe to be an open system because of the emergence of phenomena like how galaxies form and how we even from the early universe, how the Big Bang happened. We come from the more simple elements to then the emergence of more complex elements, right?
Yeah.
And how subatomic interactions happen and all that. And there's this, I don't like to call it creation, but I like to call it emergence. And I think like maybe we can synonymously talk about creation being emergence itself, like this capacity of as we have phenomena happening due to things engaging with each other in a system, those things engaging with each other allow the emergent aspects of more properties and more function because of the engagements lead to more interactions at scale. And I like to call that emergence. And we can get philosophically, and even with the problems with inconsistency of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and getting to the bottom of, okay, what is nothingness? Like we have the empty set. What does that mean? The empty set is something because it represents the empty set that contains nothing in it. That's a whole of itself. But anyway,
the set that contains all sets must contain itself.
And so,
and then the vector must also contain itself.
Yes. My idea of God is this fundamental capacity to recognize our agency, being agents we just phenomenally exist because at some point the interactions of the universe allowed life to emerge, and then life became our existential capacities and degrees of engaging with each other, and then being able to have the awareness to recognize each other's agency and optimize how we engage with each other, that has led to the cooperation of humans to at sufficiently large enough groups of humans to engage with each other due to the structured sophistication of language use and development of language. Like uniquely, what makes humans unique with how we are able to, not that we're the only species that are capable of tool use, but because of our capacity to develop structured language systems and we are able to map conceptual understandings of the world around us like symbolisms, and then attach meaning to those symbolisms, and then extend meaning into intentionality. So this idea of like taking semantics and then having pragmatics build on top of the semantics, the semantic structures, and that at some point this enables us to just guide our autonomy and how we most optimally engage and recognize each other's agency in the way that we preserve viability of each other's agency, right? Like I recognize you're human and I'm human and I'm capable of engaging and thinking about the world a certain way just as much as you are, and trying to be able to understand how can I appreciate that and engage with you. I think that like phenomenally and fundamentally this is what God means. And I think from the atheistic point of view, because I was an atheist for a very long time, you can choose to dismiss this very specific definitional understanding of God, but also a counter argument to that from a new theistic or post whatever this point of view is, because I feel like my principles align a lot with Christianity, and I even came up with a cognitive model of the Holy Trinity based on my understanding of God as being this capacity to preserve agency and recognize each other's agency, and what that means.
And the Holy Trinity as a relational concept.
Absolutely, and I think it's absolutely amazing how we could take mathematics and this understanding of God and relate it back to biblical, and even not just the Gospels, but also the Torah as well.
Of course.
Speaking of the Old Testament, but what was I going to say? The atheist can just choose to be dismissive of saying this is God, but we can go back to all the religions and say, well, the converging aspects of the principles of faith of these religious structures are that God is love, God is compassion, God is acting in good conscience, and this all comes back to agency and just how we phenomenally engage with each other and recognize each other's agency, and how that works out over time. And it's like, okay, well, this is what God means in a convergent sense. Like, how, okay, we can all relate to this is what God means, but then people can associate God with the essence of being and how everything exists. And that, to me, is not God, but God is something that feels more deep and personal and fundamental to how I engage with the world. And not just me, but how we all engage with the world, for better or worse. Recognizing not only each other's agency as humans, but even those things, life that isn't human, right? Or, because there's organisms that exist that have a functional role. If it wasn't for them, like the plants and the fungi, the birds and the bees, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't exist. We have to appreciate their agency as well, and figure out how we can symbiotically coexist with our ecosystem. And I feel like the big problem with humans is we pretty much suck the most at symbiosis, despite our capacity to be so aware of.
We have been unable to make a Copernican revolution. That's what we've been unable to do.
Tying that to so, like I said, like, I think atheism really is like, okay, well, we can call this ethics and like optimizing ethics and really appreciating the world around us because of optimizing ethics, and I guess that's fine. But again, a problem is, like, I don't think it's, to me, I'm convinced that God really, because mainstream religions and most religions, including the Abrahamic faiths, agree that God is this capacity to, that God is good, God is love, and all that stuff, which relates to what I think God is. It's like, okay, well, this is pretty convincing, and not necessarily say this is proof that God exists, but in the definitional sense that I take these convergent aspects of what God means, and in the relative sense, not the absolute sense, but in a general relative sense, based on these convergent aspects, and then we have pretty rigorous. We can have a pretty rigorous formulation of what agency means and how agential systems interact with each other in an optimal fashion, because we can rigorously demonstrate this. And it seems pretty compelling to me that, okay, this is God, but then the atheist is like, okay, well, we don't have to call that God, and maybe they don't see the point in calling that God. But then again, it's pretty hard to totally dismiss. I don't think the atheists can also, they're stuck in a corner because they can't totally dismiss that God is these converging traits of principles within the different religious and the different belief systems. And one more thing I want to say, I understand I'm going on a tangent here.
No, fine, it's great.
Well, two more things. One is, like, even from an atheist point of view, that's a belief system, right? As much as, like, every other point of view. And these belief systems, we can consider them as coordinate systems. And, the way they can communicate is through change of bases, right? If you remember your linear algebra and what have you, right? We can think about how these different faiths, like, if we are to consider interfaith dialectics, it really comes down to, okay, this is where I agree with you, and from my coordinate system, I have my change of basis to align with your understanding of what you're saying, and this is where we can come to a crossroads. So I think what I think is really fascinating about religions in general is nobody is necessarily more right than the other. It's really like their lens and of how they view the world and make associations that make sense to them, and then how that aligns with our lens in the sense of, okay, they have a coordinate system that they're using to engage with the world around them and make sense of it just as much as we do. Like through my lens of Christianity or your lens of Judaism, we have different coordinate systems, but we use.
Well, I'm not Jewish.
I'm sorry, I made that.
It's fine. But yeah.
Well, whatever your what you consider yourself, and you can get into that, but like we can consider that point of view a coordinate system, and the interfaith dialogue would be like, okay, the change of bases, communication, interactions happening, and then finally, I would say in terms of faith, I just want, I guess, like, I guess I understand where you're coming from faith, from a faith-based perspective, but maybe, because I've been an atheist for such a long time, I can totally understand people are like, okay, well, I still don't understand what faith means. I think faith has a lot to do with how, not necessarily believing in God, but wrestling with uncertainty and having confidence in how I engage with the world around us and my community, and how the outcomes can turn out. So I feel like having faith is a lot about, okay, how do we work together to optimize our fitness and hope for the best, because we don't know what's going to happen, but we try to hope for the best and work towards the best. And I think that's what having faith is really all about. I guess it's not so much about, I feel like believing in God amplifies that. I mean, from my point of view, it does. It just feels like there's this sense of deepness in the belief, in this spiritual sense. And maybe you can be an atheist and be like, okay, well, I think faith is still makes rational sense, because I don't need to believe in God to live in an uncertain environment. Like, the world is such an uncertain, chaotic place, and like, who knows what's going to happen, but I'm trying to do my best to optimize my fitness, and I hope things work out for the best. And I'm going to do my best to work together with other people as best as I can to preserve my viability, my fitness, but also try and symbiotically coexist and be mindful of others in that process of hoping for the best. And like, who knows, like, how my engagement with the world is going to pan out for better or worse, but I'm going to do my best to do what I think is right, and hope that that the outcomes that I hope to happen, and not in the selfish sense too, but I feel like having faith is also acknowledges a sense of humility that, I'm not immortal, I can't do everything, there's limitations in my being. So I think faith also has to do with like acknowledging one's limitations and how they engage with the world too, and how they're honest with themselves, and how that pans out, for better or worse, like how we engage with the world around us. But I feel like there's so much dynamics to that, like talking about faith, right? And like the atheists watching this are like, wow, like I learned so much about what faith can mean. It's not just this, I feel like so much wrong with interpretation is from a fundamentalist extremist point of view, right? And we all were like grew up with that, and we're like, oh no, the Bible thumpers and all these people preaching, and it's all sounds like riddles. Like, how do we make sense of it? But anyway, I think that's a good description of
that was great.
God.
At the very end, you talk about humility, right? It says in the Bible, the humble shall be exalted, right?
Yes.
And faith as wrestling with uncertainty, and if we look at really the expanse of human history, it's perhaps the constant pursuit of illuminating the darkness, perhaps, right? The darkness of uncertainty, the darkness of our own existence. But I was going to touch on, right, and I want to kind of segue this into, my book, because I think that's probably the natural direction this should take, is that, when you're talking about this development, it seems as if you had anchored on to this process of development that you have seen across time and in comparative religion, where there's this greater development towards, human agency, but I guess human agency can boil down to maybe the twin pillars of perhaps freedom and equality, that we should have a greater ability to orient ourselves and to practice our agency, but simultaneously we must recognize the equality of persons and in their own, orienting their lives in their own actualizing of their agency. And this is where the Jewish sort of dialectic and the Jewish story, this is where it actually begins, right? Because obviously, there's Genesis, but the Genesis isn't necessarily the Jewish story. That's the story of mankind. The Jewish story begins with the story of Exodus, right? And you can read Thomas Cahill, The Gift of the Jews, and a lot of modern writers, and Michael Walzer. It's like that is the first story of freedom and equality in human history, right? It's the first time that it is asserted that all men are made in the image of God, and then simultaneously that this assertion is made with the liberation of say a group that had their agency restricted, right? And then it begins this idea of a redemption across time, right? And I'm not trying to go into the fundamentalist direction, but rather, look at history as this developing process, and then attach it to theology rather than pure biology. And so what I was going to say is that it seems as if there's this dialectic, not seems as if, there is this dialectic between man and God, or Hegelian dialectic, let me say that, a Hegelian dialectic. And for those who aren't very familiar, the Hegelian dialectic is basically the idea that opposites can converge, that you'll have a thesis and an antithesis that are opposing concepts, but these can synthesize into a new thesis that will then have its own antithesis, which will, so on and so forth, synthesize, and until there's, in the Hegelian conception, this absolute spirit at the end of time or whatnot, and sort of the end of the process, perhaps, right? And that represents God as the ultimate universal end. But that Hegelian dialectic, at least as it's represented in the Jewish story, is the dialectic between man and God, between the limited and the limitless, the finite and the infinite. And this sort of dialectic, I think, really does ground or structure the narrative of Western human history. Perhaps not Eastern as much, but very much so Western, especially post-Enlightenment. But what I was going to say is that in my book, the main aim of my book is to sort of find and explicate the underlying motor of development for Judaism, because I guess I don't think many people are incredibly familiar with Judaism. I mean, there's ideas of Jewishness and Jewish identity, and then obviously there's Zionism and Israel and all these. But Judaism as a concept, as a religion, as a theology, remains largely enigmatic, mysterious, unknown. And so the aim of the book is to say, or is to go through history and explicate perhaps those sort of abstract and more fundamental processes of development, or the fundamental motor that is the guiding sort of thread of Judaism. And so that fundamental motor that I discovered, and in my actual interactions, I was in New York last week and I talked to a lot of rabbis, and this sort of seems to be maybe the consensus in the Chabad-Lubavitch sphere as well. And I can get into that later. But the main idea is that Judaism is represented by a dialectic between particularity and universality. The idea is that the Jewish people, a particular group of people, are chosen by God, right? The chosen nation. But there's a chosenness toward a certain end, a certain universal end. And this is the beginning of the Jewish story, right? God selects Abraham in Genesis, and from his stalk all the way down, you have Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, Solomon, all the way down, right? And the idea is that the chosenness is towards a universal end, that the dialectic is postured towards a completion. My bad, getting a call. But that dialectic that begins in the very beginning is what birthed this idea called the Jewish mission. And the Jewish mission is something fundamental that I think most people are not very familiar of. And I'll say it like this. I'll begin this sort of with a narrative. When we look at Judaism and the Jewish people, they stand alone among the people of the world, right? In that they have persisted across time for 3,000 years. No other group has existed like that. No other group has persisted amidst the oppression and persecution of history. And no group has persisted without a nation, right? You'll have an expansive history of maybe the Roman Empire, right? But that's all predicated on the idea of a nation and a state that continues to exist. But for 2,000 years, the Jewish people existed without a state, right? For much of their history, there has been no state, yet the Jewish people have continued to exist. So how is this possible? What is it? What is the fundamental essence or element that is enabling Jewish survival? And so there's a lot of literature on the topic. And in my own study, in my book, the basic idea is that it is the Jewish mission that is a necessary consequence of the particular universal paradox. And I guess to explicate this a little bit more, it's the idea that there's a purpose for suffering, right? The exile, which happens in 70 AD after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Roman Hadrian exile, the term for that in the Jewish theology is galut in the Hebrew. It has two meanings. It means one, suffering. It means one, deprivation of statehood, and two, it means suffering for the sake of mankind. And so the idea is that in Isaiah, when it says the suffering servant, that isn't, in Jewish theology, that isn't Jesus. That's literally the Jewish collective. That there's a meaning to the suffering, that there's a meaning to all of this, and there's an eventual redemption. And so this is where this idea of temporality, I think, emerges as well. It's a famous saying. They say that the Greeks discovered space, but the Jewish people discovered time. And what does that really mean? It means that in the Greek conception, there's a sort of cyclical idea where everything is eternally reoccurring, and there's day and night, and there's the seasons, and all these things. But with the Jewish conception, there's a beginning that is outside of time, a divine, transcendental beginning, and there will be an end. There will also be a divine, transcendental, redemptive end. And, if you go into the theology of the Messiah, and when does it emerge in Jewish thinking, when does it emerge in theology, you'll immediately encounter the fact that it has not been there since the beginning. It has not been there since the beginning. And so, and that's an immediate question is like, well, why hasn't it been there since the beginning, right? It begins to emerge, right? Obviously, the Messiah is a descendant of David, so it's after the time of David. It emerges around the time of the Babylonian exile. But the important point to understand here is that perhaps, yes, the idea of the Messiah did not exist within Judaism, but the necessary potential for the Messiah to be, the idea of the Messiah to be generated within Judaism existed from the very beginning as a necessary consequence of sort of the dialectical construction or conception of Judaism. And so in the book, I try to relate Jewish development in line with a theological rendering of the Jewish mission across time, in line with this rendering between particularity and universality, and then thread this to the 18th and 19th century, when Jewish people are emancipated into Western society, when there are these new possibilities and emerging identities, and you have the development of Reform Judaism that postures more towards universality rather than particularity, and eventually you have the development of Zionism, which is, Herman Cohen says that Zionism is a returns the Jewish people to history, and so the idea is that you have this duality or dialectic between particularity and universality, and the Jewish people have choices to make in this dialectic. They can power towards universality, or they can posture more towards particularity. And Zionism is sort of a representation of the posture back towards particularity rather than universality. That has to do with sort of the idea of Zion as the light to all the nations, as a place of moral perfection, of political freedom, of earthly bliss. Obviously, the current state of Israel does not reflect the concept of Zion that has been a part of Jewish theology for 2,000 years in any way, shape, or form. This is why the Satmar Jewish community, they are vehement anti-Zionists. This is why you have the Chabad-Lubavitch group, they don't have a particular stance. And this is why, for a very long time in America, Reform Jews were also vehemently anti-Zionist. But I don't want to get super political or go down that route. But the main idea I'm trying to relate this here is that this dialectic between particularity and universality, I really think it's what you were talking about earlier too, that there's this development across time from a beginning of perhaps, less agency and less understanding, less awareness, and a development of more awareness. And in my book, I'm trying to relate this theological conception to ideological or modern conceptions and bridge this gap and intersect theology and ideology and modern thinking. And I think that's where the study of Jewish literature and Jewish theology is sort of it's a lacuna. There's not much in it. And so I'm trying to illuminate that area in the book and sort of give a comprehensive map, a genealogy of that development. But this is part of a larger project. There's going to be a lot more that I do and keep on. And I want to, because I'm only 24. I really started writing about a year and a half ago, and really started getting into philosophy about 2 years ago when I first read Nietzsche, and that was a unique experience that I don't recommend for anyone, but I do say it's valuable. So, but yeah, if you're interested in Judaism, I would say it's a read. But there's a lot more to read. But maybe just listening to this is good too.
So I guess I could see what you were saying about in terms of thinking about what is the difference between considering Christ as being that representation of setting the best, like how we ought to be that light that that shines and best represents the choices we make for each other and our people. I feel like I have a hard time understanding, okay, what's the difference between like the from the Zionist perspective, or maybe not necessarily Zionist perspective, but like as the chosen, like being looking back into Exodus and thinking about, okay, well, this is not necessarily about Christ, but I feel like Christ extends on that and is, I guess, a simplexification. I feel like Christianity is a lot of what Christianity is a simplexification that expands more on the problem of evil and why we ought to pay more attention to it because of our capacity to deceive one another, which I think there's a great case to make. But Judaism, I feel like the difference between Judaism and Christianity primarily is, other than acknowledging that Satan doesn't exist and hell doesn't really exist.
Yeah, exactly.
There isn't really there's no reincarnation or afterlife necessarily.
Yeah.
And I guess you can get more into that, because I'm still trying to learn more about like the real differences between Judaism and Christianity, and what Christ represents, and what does the chosen, like being the chosen people, what does that represent, and how do we as the chosen people, considering I'm Jewish by genetics.
Okay, yeah.
But I do wrestle with this. Currently, I'm wrestling with this identity of, like, I suppose, Judeo-Christian identity at this point, because it's like, well, I relate a lot to the principles of Christianity, but at the same time, I'm curious to understand how that differs from Judaism. And I guess one thing I also want to address, too, is what is the difference between being spiritual and being religious, or being identifying oneself as being part of a particular faith, whether one identifies themselves as being Jewish or Christian. Like, what's the difference about being involved in that sort of community, in the Jewish community or the Christian community, or being part of a religion? What's the difference between being in part of a religion as opposed to being part of a faith, or just believing in the spiritual sense of what God means and what God represents, as opposed to being part of a religion? I guess you can expand more on your points on that, and I can make my own clarifications.
Yeah, I'll go in real quick. Right, you are correct that in the Jewish conception there isn't a heaven, hell. There's something called it's just skipping my mind now, but there's a sort of Greek word for hell. I forget what it was. It starts with an S. I forget exactly what it is, but yeah, there isn't necessarily this conception of heaven and hell as there is later in Christianity and Islam, right? And the reason is simple, is because redemption in the Jewish conception is earthly. The Messianic expectation, Joseph Klauser writes about this in the Messianic Idea. He says that, there's sort of two parallel ideas. There's two parallel ideas in the Jewish conception. That there's a Messianic expectation and the Messianic era. And the Messianic expectation is that there's a time when there will be earthly bliss, moral perfection, political freedom, and that's Zion. That Zion represents that. And then there's simultaneously the belief in the Messianic Redeemer, a strong leader. And so the Jewish conception is also, from these ideas, is very political as well. That it is a political redemption, that it is going to be a nation, and obviously, right, when we look at Jesus, right, this is the main point of distinction between Judaism and Christianity, and also Islam, is that who is Jesus, the character, nature, divinity, all these things are the main question, and so structured from the idea of the particular universal paradox, right. The idea is that if Judaism does represent this problem, this process of a dialectic of trying to reach synthesis, the question you have to ask is, does Jesus represent that synthesis? Does he represent the universality, right? And then, in many respects, there is a most definite notion that is represented in the actions and character and deeds, and even the final story of like the suffering that's transformed into glory, and all these various things. But that at least in the Jewish conception, right? Not Jewish conception. In the Christian conception, right? The chosenness is now, there's no longer a Jewish chosenness, right? I guess Jesus says something like, there is no Jew or Gentile in me, right? He says that, I think in Revelations or something like that, right? And then there's also the simultaneous idea of a new covenant, right? And some of the sort of metaphorical ideas is 7 days of creation. And then in the theology of Christianity, it's right, Jesus dies on the I think it's the 5th day or perhaps the 6th day, and then he rests on the 7th day of the week. He rests on Saturday, which is Sabbath, right? Shabbat, right? And the same that God rested on the 7th day, and then what happens on the first day of the week on Sunday? There's a resurrection, there's a light, right, or whatever it may be. And so this is where the idea of a new creation comes from in the Christian eschatology and theology, and that this represents the new beginning. There was an end, and now there's a new beginning. But there is a distinction that has to be made. Right? The Christian conception is not necessarily a earthly political redemption. it is a spiritual redemption, that one is redeemed by Jesus. But the Jewish conception is that the redemption must necessarily be earthly. It must necessarily be political. And this is where, like, Rambam, which is Maimonides, one of the most famous Jewish philosophers of all time, these 12 principles, 13 principles, the 12 principles that the Jewish person must await the Messiah. And so a lot of I guess the Jewish identity is rooted in awaiting for that redemption. And this is where we really get into a distinction, right? At least even as it relates to nihilism, right? Whereas in Christianity and Islam, redemption has already occurred. Like, history is already over. That's one way of putting it. That the dialectic is over. That particular university have been bridged. That the man has met God, and that is concretized in Jesus. But in the Jewish question, that bridge has not been, that gap has not been bridged yet. There's an ongoing walk. And when we look at, this is the question I think emerges now in the modern day: is there an ongoing? It appears as if there is. It appears as if, at least in the minds of most people, we're gripped by the idea that gap still exists. That there's so much more that needs to be done. That there's progress that we are oriented toward. That there is some sort of redemption we're going to. And in my work, I'm not trying to make like dogmatic assertions, but rather trying to explicate like the theology as it relates to our understanding of the world, right? And sort of maybe some comparative religion. But right, when we talk about meaning, and there's so much written about this, especially in the psychological sense, there is the divine truth in religion, undeniably so, right? And there's something universal in it when you're talking about convergence of various ideas among all the faiths of the world. What is that? What is that universality? And that kind of tells us there is something universal. There is something that is divinely transcendental, that is universal, that sort of binds us. And this, I'm going to go into the next question you had, right? Being spiritual versus religious. And this is the fundamental problem that emerges immediately after. It's that, if we are to hold the Abrahamic faiths to be true, well, then we have to contend with a number of different situations. We have to contend with the idea of the Jewish mission. Contend with the idea of the Jewish mission as something ongoing throughout history, as a narrative of redemption. Then we have to contend with the fact, does Jesus represent that redemption, right? And then we also have to contend with the sort of Islamic side of things, that, well, Jesus is not the Son of God, but he is the Messiah. And then how does that concretize? How does that synthesize? And what I found is that, when we get into the sort of dogmatic assertions of identity, maybe more problems are created than solved. And it's not clear to me anymore, because I've taken stances on either sides, and I've been sometimes, right, because, there's a famous line in the Bible, and this is what you'll hear very often from maybe Christian evangelists, is that there is no way, there's no way to the Father except through me, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you take that idea, right, as it is said, well, then the whole idea of a convergence, of being spiritual, is annulled, because Jesus is the only way to God. No other way exists. Mm-hmm. And so that's a problem that I would say is a problem that exists in sort of rift between being spiritual and having this fundamental knowledge or faith in an existence of a God, but then how do we bridge the gap of identity, right? And part of the problem is that, we become sort of tribalistic in that sort of conception. And right, when you're saying earlier about, this expansive human history, this development of understanding, recognizing the agency of people, with this perspective, it's that we continuously maybe neglect the agency of other people as it relates to their identity, whatever that identity may be. And so, what's is a solution? What's going on here? Well, I'm not certain. I'm not positive. And this is sort of the purpose of continuing to learn and continuing to try and believe. And this is what I've really realized, because I've talked to many people in this last month or so, because I've been trying to share my book and all these various things, and I've gone and talked to rabbis, is that we must have faith in the idea of communication. I think that's like one of the most pivotal things, is that conversation is capable of bridging gaps of understanding between people, that is capable of doing that. Because the moment we lose that, the moment we say that's not possible, nothing is possible. And I think that there has been a tendency towards that direction, at least in my conversations, that it appears that truth and that's sort of just a negation of the possibility of anything universal at all. And so I am someone that has devout faith in the idea of communication. There is the ability for us to communicate and for us to bridge a gap of understanding between people that are different. And I think when you become incredibly religious and like super, like incredibly oriented with this specific religious identity, you sort of lose that ability. And there's another thing in the Bible, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word, that means logos, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is that the Word is truth, and that the Word enables us to talk and to reach the truth. And so that's something that I believe in. I'm not sure how comprehensive that was, but
yeah, that was pretty good. And I feel like the truth is really how can we most genuinely preserve each other's agency in terms of preserving viability, while like intuitively, symbiotically, better engaging with the world around us. And I think problems with that, we can get into the whole Tower of Babel and Babylonia. That I feel like you mentioned problems with communication and like just being able to keep that stable. Otherwise, we have this falling Tower of Babel issue where I feel like the big issue with Babylon, and this goes back to the biblical scripture, right? And it's quite detailed, astonishingly so. But the problem there is social. I guess this capacity for social structural incoherence, where we just lose because we become less related to one another, and we develop more tribal tendencies, and become more primitive in being able to relate to each other and be able to effectively communicate due to language barriers and just the barrier of understanding. And we rely so much on completely improving and augmenting our language systems and like developing more language systems. And it's like, okay, well, how do we keep track of that? How do we keep that stable? Otherwise, it'll just collapse in on each other. And that's like the greatest threat of humanity, is just losing this capacity to effectively communicate needs and desires. Largely needs, but I mean, desires really motivate needs and the drive to how we not only look after ourselves but like each other, and how is that meaningful. And I guess for me, it's not so much the religiosity aspect, because I feel like for me, the difference between spirituality and religion, where religion it takes off into being different, is this idea of community and structure. You have this
that's what I was going to go into as well.
Community that relates to a specific identity of a specific spiritual identity, and there's this communion-based structure of this spiritual identity. And I feel like this communion-based structure can be fluid. You know, we don't have to generalize we don't have to generalize what it means to be religious or too religious. I mean, like, who's to say that you have to follow very strict aspects of what is literally said throughout biblical scripture, because we can just interpret it as a meta, you know. We can draw we can make sense of it like a codex. I like to think of the Gospels and the Torah as a codex, which we use our capacity of reasoning, that we use language to make sense of. We have to pick out, okay, well, using our best judgment and how we preserve viability and appreciate each other's agency. We have to figure out, okay, what do we take literally in scripture as opposed to, okay, well, this is an extremity. Like a lot of like what is said in Leviticus, there's just a lot of just brutal examples of like, what humanity does, like in terms of failing to communicate, and like how people are exiled and what have you, and treated in such inhumane manners. Like we see that in scripture. And even atheists would say, well, there's so much terrible things mentioned in scripture. Well, that's part of the challenge in having faith, and having that sense of identity of following the best principles, is making sense of like the codex. We don't take the scripture too literally, but we try and make the right logical associations that are, of that which is mentioned in the Torah, that which is mentioned in the Gospel. And, maybe you can have a Judeo-Christian perspective, or maybe you have, you're more you have a more Judaic point of view, or maybe maybe it's not orthodox if it's more meta, but I struggle with wrestling with the distinction of, okay, what does it mean to be orthodox, and how orthodox can you be, and how literal do you take what is said?
Yeah, it's
I figured I'd mention those things.
Yeah, and I'll go into that a little bit too, because that's one of the things that I've been encountering is maybe the fundamental problem of, say, authority, right? Because and you and I agree on this. It's like, well, we have this human, it is clear to us that recognizing other people's agency is a good, that it is correct. However, how can we absolutely assert that, right? Can we absolutely assert that to another individual, right? Or is that merely our own interpretation of that codex? And so the problem is perplexing, because even if we have, say, sort of a finite, explicit codex, the subjective interpretation or subjective experience of humanity, it makes it difficult to come to a consensus. And even sometimes, a consensus is not necessarily correct. There are many consensuses that have led to very terrible things in human history. And so this is part of where the idea of faith also comes in, where you have to have faith that there is a purpose to doing that. There's a purpose to keeping on doing that it's not meaningless, that communication is possible, that there is a development that is good, that we can attach ourselves to and move through history in that way, and that there will be problems, that there will be, they say the righteous will fall 7 times but get back again, right? And that's something I've been encountering, right? Because, that's like the sort of Catholic or the Orthodox notion of Christianity is really rooted in the absolute, right? And there is a Catholic position on everything, and then as if you have the identity of being a Catholic, you adopt that position. And in some ways, it is a very simple life, right? That you have the views given to you. However, maybe that's a robbing of agencies, Sure. And it's not so clear to me that. It's not so clear to me that, for a long time I would be postured toward, there needs to be this 100% absolute. But it's not so clear to me that even if that is it's not so clear to me that perhaps it's more so that the search for the absolute, the process towards the absolute, is what is absolute rather than the absolute itself, if that makes sense. And this is sort of a bit of process theology, and I'm a little bit familiar with that. Right. And it seems to me that there's a Jewish conception there too, but obviously, when we say Christian, that's an extension of Jewishness, of the Jewish conception, that there is a constant search for redemption, or a constant, right? The Chabad-Lubavitch perspective is that, and this is really the main Jewish perspective, is that the Jewish person has a responsibility to bring about the age of the Messiah, right? And obviously, not all Jewish people abide or believe that, but the idea of the Jewish mission, it implies a certain responsibility that if you're chosen for a certain end, and there's a responsibility, right? And this and that, and so this idea of searching, of feeling a responsibility towards an end that has yet to arrive, and perhaps that is perhaps an ultimate answer to nihilism in some ways, I think. But like I said, yeah, the problem of authority is incredibly difficult. It really is. And even if you look at sort of like the split in the Christian church, right, between the Orthodox and the Catholics, and then you look at the Protestant Reformation, sort of the exodus from the papacy, all these things, it's very difficult. Even let's say I believe in God, and then I believe in the Christian God, and it's like, well, then where do you go? It's like, where do you go then? And then it's like the problems become more and more minute. And I think there's a Buddhist saying, it's that, the man is pushing a cow through a gate, and the cow gets stuck at the tail. It's like, why is the cow getting stuck at the tail? And so there's a profound idea there. We keep on going down and down and down. There's always something there that restricts us. And perhaps that's just part of the human dilemma, but maybe also what it means to be human.
Well, I think a large part of the human dilemma deals with veridical perception limitations, in terms of we're constantly vulnerable to generalizing based on our cognitive biasing of the world around us. even in science, you have theories, and then you can always have some new theory come along and debunk the older theory. It's like, well, like, wow, relativity in quantum mechanics it makes so much sense to a degree, but then something else comes along and extends on relativity in quantum mechanics, or demonstrates that, well, certain aspects of relativity in quantum mechanics make some sense while others don't, and then here's how we make more sense of what's really happening. So, you know, there's this more, you know, we come to more of a means to agreeing as a pop regarding the proportion of people agreeing, right? Like, if a sufficiently large enough group of humans representing the population agree on a certain generalization of how we model the world around us and kind of map our navigation and our understanding of what knowledge means and what's the difference between knowledge and information and noise that just doesn't really mean much. And what's really going to help us navigate our survival and our capacity to engage with each other and communicate with each other, as opposed to just being noise and being a distraction or what have you. Where was I going?
The generalization.
Yes. So I think veridical perception, this is, that we'll never have a true understanding of reality, that we're constantly just interacting with reality. I don't know if you're familiar with Don Hoffman, talking about how reality is an illusion. I wouldn't call it an illusion in the sense that, like, it's a hallucination, and we don't... I think that it's elusive in the sense that we're constantly generalizing reality, but at the same time, like, if enough of us come to an agreement that, okay, well, this is still a generalization, but at least we can make a map, we can make a slightly less noisier map to navigate our circumstances and preserve viability. That's ultimately what we're doing here. But also, like, you mentioned nihilism quite a bit of times, and I think there's more to the pot that's problematic to our nature of being than nihilism. Like, nihilism really reducing what I consider nihilism to be is like this reduction to nothingness or meaninglessness, that ultimately nothing truly makes sense. I mean, like, all is relative and what have you, and like, the Buddhists can argue about emptiness, even though emptiness is not necessarily nihilism. It relates to this problem of veridical perception and community meaning and what that's relative to. But I in my work, I came up with what I call the 5 fatal tendencies. Nihilism being one of them, but the others being hedonism, narcissism, masochism, and sadism. So on the other hand, overindulgence in pleasure, overindulgence in pride, overindulgence in inflicting pain on oneself, or overindulgence in inflicting pain on others, or just if that makes sense. So I feel like while nihilism represents one aspect of this that really can bring the downfall of humanity, where we just get lost in the sense of meaning, I think that this overwhelmingness of, like, too much pleasure, too much pride, too much self-harm, too much otherly harm, I think those are also just as...
I would add on real quick, and I would ask, well, like, with the nihilism, it would be, wouldn't the nihilism include those other fatal tendencies? What I mean is that wouldn't the nihilist say that there is no point to be a hedonist? There is no point to be a sadist. There is no point to be a masochist. There's no. I could feel a pleasure or something, but there's no true meaning to these things. And so, and ultimately, I mean, the nihilist could even say, well, I've tried religion. I found there's no meaning to any of these things. But I see what you're saying. I mean, it is a fatal tendency. But I think, like, these other things are distractions from the onset of nihilism.
I think they're not mutually exclusive of each other. I think they kind of, like, interact with each other, right? Like, nothing's purely hedonistic or whatever, right? Like, I feel like they, okay, what does the hedonism lead to? Well, it might lead to self-harm, right? Or it might lead to harming others, or it might have to do with pride, or it has to do with this lack of meaning or whatever, right? So I feel like you can't, I wouldn't necessarily like, okay, the root is nihilism. Okay, why is the root nihilism? It's like, okay, well, what if they're just, there's these marginal associations with each other, and how each of the traits, each of the tendencies arise, and how it impacts our engagement with ourselves and each other and our environment. So I feel like,
I guess I take from like even like some of the Buddhistic foundational things. Life is suffering, and then like for me, it's like when I look at the religious imperative, it's like, life is suffering. What are we going to do about it? What do we do about that fact? And so then it's like, well, there's purpose, there's meaning, and then the Buddhistic idea, right? When we were talking earlier about like the generalizations, it's like, what are your thoughts on this? Like the Buddhistic conception of oneness, right, as the ultimate end of being, and the oneness is very difficult because as soon as you say something is something, then you're creating a duality. You're saying that this is, and then therefore everything else that is not this is not that. And so there's a not distinction or a category of what is not that. And so the oneness is sort of transcending the duality of existence, the duality of
like
it is or is not.
Non-duality, right? Oneness is
exactly
okay.
And that's the thing. It's like to say that something is, you necessarily must say that other things are not that thing.
Yeah,
and that's why they say
negation, right? Okay.
Yes. And so the problem that immediately emerges is that for the Buddhists, like the moment you think you grasp, so the oneness is, in many ways, it's sort of even a rejection of consciousness. Or maybe, in the grand scheme of complexities, it's the final state of consciousness. Who knows, right? Once you are fully aware of all things, is there anything left to be aware of? But must you be aware of the fact that you're aware of all things?
How can you know you're aware of all things? How do you? That's just so absurd, right? Because of problems of veridical perception, we're never aware of all things. Our sensations, like our capacity to engage with the stimuli around us, like limits, like constrains our capacity of awareness. Anyway, so it's like even then, it's like, that's a contradiction to like, okay, well, if we can't be totally aware, then that means there's no total awareness. It's just a constrained awareness.
Yeah.
It's really
there's this notion in like process theology where there's like everything, everywhere, all at once. I think there's a movie titled that too. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that the oneness, and it's like in those moments of like maybe pure concrescence, because I think that's the process word of Whitehead. In those pure moments of concrescence, you are one with all things, and that's what God is. Mm-hmm. Oneness, right? But then in that moment of oneness, there is no desire. It does syncretize somewhat with the Buddhistic conception, but maybe not as practical in terms of, and also not as not part of a sort of more historical narrative, rather more just in the pure consciousness of the human mind.
You mentioned suffering, and I guess, would you say suffering is it's like this dynamic of, on the one hand, things that I do to penalize my fitness, on the other hand there are things that I don't have control over that can penalize my fitness. So like suffering,
it's both, without a doubt, but yes, suffering
is also associated with like how our understanding of cellular senescence comes to be like, okay, well, we become more suboptimal because of entropy, and because as life we tried to optimize how, like, the cost of metabolism and cognitive load, dealing with entropy, how things go from a more ordered state to a more chaotic state, or just like being able to maintain a functionally integral state to optimize our fitness over time, that just becomes more and more suboptimal because our systems become, less able to metabolize effectively, and the cost just gets worse to deal with, and we suffer more as we get older. I guess that's what that means. But I guess on the one hand we can think of suffering as like having to do with sin, but also I feel like sin more properly associates with like things I can do to potentially deceive myself, where it's like, okay, well, I can have there's a lot of studies that say alcohol is not good for me to consume, yet okay, I'm gonna have a beer or whatnot once a week or so. Like, I'll moderately consume alcohol, even though it's better for me not to consume alcohol at all. So I'm committing sin, but it's not on a level that it's kind of like negligible, right? So I feel like sin, as opposed to suffering, like sin has to do with like I'm aware that I'm deceiving myself on some level, and that level of deception might not be meaningful enough for me to like really incur fitness penalties, where I'm like, there's, you know, I don't really have to worry about suboptimality. It's like I'm doing something that can negligibly penalize my fitness, and I'm aware that I'm doing that thing, so I'm committing sin. But I feel like there's this whole spectrum of sin, but it's not sin is not necessarily suffering if we consider suffering to be, you know, the inevitability that we're gonna eventually cease to exist. Like we eventually die, and like we just, there's enough fitness penalties, and entropy just has its way with us, and we cease to exist, and that ultimately that's suffering. And there's degrees of suffering too, but suffering's not necessarily sin. But I figured I'd add that.
I'll add on to that real quick. But I guess the final point is that, at least in the Abrahamic concept, more so Christian, but also Jewish, but Muslim as well, that sin is the beginning of suffering. That you know, from the Garden of Eden, that the disobedience is what begins suffering. It's, you know, Adam is condemned to a life of labor and toil, and then Eve must suffer the pain of childbirth. And this is what they say. I mean, you know, what does God say in Genesis? He says that, do not eat from the tree lest you should die. And so the existential trauma of knowing that our existence is going to come to an end begins at that moment. And what does the tree represent? It represents becoming aware of the self, right? Adam and Eve, they recognize that they are naked. They gain an awareness of themselves. And so the sin is the beginning of the suffering. And the awareness of the self is also the beginning of the suffering. But in the beginning of the conversation, we're talking about how, well, it seems as if that existence is on this path to a greater awareness of self. And so that would tell us that suffering as such is perhaps not wrong. Or rather, that maybe suffering as such has a purpose, has a meaning, that it is a necessary and inevitable part of existence, not only because of the way that nature and humans, that we exist in this environment, but rather that it is also part of a greater narrative towards greater awareness. But the beginning of awareness is sin, and the beginning of suffering is awareness of self. And so, I don't know, there's a lot of cool ideas there that sort of interplay together. And for me, my broader study is like, when I look at human life, and when I look at people, and especially in our day and age, it seems as if to me that nihilism is a large problem. And that you said those other 4 fatal tendencies. I mean, that's another big thing that we see all around us, and that, you know, people are grappling with existential concerns about their lives, about their existences. And, you know, there's all these abilities to distract ourselves and various things. But ultimately, the distractions and the consumerism and the materialism, they don't satisfy us. They don't fulfill us. It's sort of temporary, perhaps. Maybe it's a temporary numbness that we get to experience, or a sedation. And so it seems to me that we are confronted with the nihilism, and even today, right? You know, suffering has really been, especially in the West, decreased to such an unbelievable degree. There's still this existential dilemma, and what I've discovered is that, you know, you can read Victor meaning, right? And it's the story of, you know, in the camp in Auschwitz, and you can sort of try to put yourself in that situation and think, you know, what if I was there, you know, and dealing with this grueling physical suffering and spiritual anguish, you know, could you keep on going? And for me, in my grand narrative, it's that, like, the suffering, you know, that there is a meaning, that there is a purpose, that it is an inevitable and necessary part of existence, and that in going in that need, maybe perhaps there's a need for that as well. There's a need, believing that the suffering is purposeful and that it's necessary. That, to me, is the fundamental story of Judaism. The idea of suffering for a purpose, the idea of suffering for meaning, the idea that there is the suffering servant, right? And that's the same idea of Christianity, that there is a suffering that occurs on the cross, but there's an eventual glory. There's an eventual resurrection. There's a light that emerges out of the darkness. And that fundamental story of the suffering that is necessary, that man must go through, that I think is the story of humanity. And I think that's we go through that in our own lives in many ways. Maybe that's what their cross, if you want to follow me. I mean, there's a lot of other conceptions there. There's persecution that you will face, but the idea of being crucified so that you may be reborn, suffering so that you may reach glory. I mean, then and the same idea is true in Judaism. You must suffer to be redeemed. Yeah, and so I try to capitalize on those themes in my book, and I don't know if I did a great job, but it's something I want to keep on understanding and developing, because like I said, I'm not interested in Judaism as such. It's remarkable and phenomenal category of knowledge, but I'm more so interested in how Judaism fits into the broader map of modernity and the broader map of meaning, and really meaning perhaps is the main word. And that's because really the entire impetus for my philosophical exploration, all these things has been from a search for meaning, and a need to search for meaning. And I encountered Nietzsche at the very beginning, right? Nietzsche is not the nihilist philosopher, but rather the philosopher that gives an answer to nihilism, right? Man has killed God, must we not become gods to make up for our crime?
That's quite deep.
That's
right. I commend you for being able to just read Nietzsche and Hegel. Oh man, I this would drive. That's why.
Well, Nietzsche's great. Hegel's not. Hegel's rough. But Nietzsche, there's a certain vitality. He's a great writer. There is a vitality in what. But the thing is that the writing is beautiful. It's artistry, really. But the consequence of the writing, of consuming that, you're going to go through something. You're putting yourself through something, and something will emerge on the other side. But you have to be willing to do that. And that's a decision that must be made.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I appreciate the people that interpret, that go through interpreting what these philosophers are saying in their writings. Because, for me, especially because I struggle a lot with reading comprehension due to autism, even though, part of what's been helping me a lot, besides watching videos and understanding more hands-on, descriptions and points of view, looking at visuals and all that stuff about, how people break things down, different ways of thinking, is this mathematics, which ironically mathematics led me to God, and I never would have thought that.
Yeah, Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem was one of the main, actually, it was crazy actually.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. You would think that'd lead you away from God, right?
Yeah, right. It's wait a minute, what's going on here? And then and then you have a lot of people like Isaac Newton and a lot of famous people that have developed our understanding of the sciences, like Leonard Euler, of course.
Yeah.
One of the
what's it called? Euler's
mathematicians.
Yeah, but it's e to the pi, or it's what is it? E to the pi I.
Yeah, isn't that something, right? Just how
the 5 fundamental numbers of math.
The exponential interpolates itself, and really that's just a series. You add up a series of fractions, right? Yeah. 1 over 1 plus 1 over 2 plus 1 over 3. Well, really, the formula is 1 over n factorial. I think that's what it is. It's the summation, and a factorial is if I have 3 factorial, it's 3 times 2 times 1, right? Or 4 factorial is 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, and you get the summation of all increasing what n is, and you get Euler's number. I believe that's how that works. That's how you calculate it. Which it just keeps going. It's a transcendental number, right? It just keeps going. There's no end to the compute. It's not computable. Isn't that interesting?
That's remarkable. And are you familiar with Euler's identity?
That's e to the I pi, right?
Right. Plus 1 equals 0.
Yeah.
And isn't that crazy too? You have the 5 fundamental numbers of mathematics. And so it's like, well, what's going on?
Yeah, you get a circle. You don't just get a circle, but you get like this. You get a toroidal wave, and then you can define the wave function with e to the I times pi, right? You can define the generalization of the wave function, right? So, which is interesting. I think it helps to think about a slinky, and like I have a slinky, and I pull it, and then that's e to the I times pi, right? It's like whoosh, and you just go like that, and you just fold it into a donut, and it's like just and that's what's happening, and you can think about that on different dimensions, which is just and I feel like what's also amazing about math is just seems like pure creativity, like pure like exploration of abstraction and the rigidities of abstraction. I'll send you my art blog, but I work on these art pictures that pull one out for you to take a look at real quick. This is one I finished recently, right?
Wow.
And the motivation is I go through math and physics books, and it just helps me think. Mathematics, like I guess it's part of kinesthetic learning. I developed this late appreciation for kinesthetic learning, just interacting with things like fidget toys and whatnot. It just really helps me engage with information because I struggle a lot with reading comprehension. And I do this. I host these neurodivergent learning sessions. I don't know if you had a chance to check out my video content, but
I checked out a couple of them, but I didn't have a whole bunch of time. Life's going through stuff at the moment.
Oh man, tell me about it. Right? I told you a little bit about what I'm going through.
Common dilemma.
I don't know how much more time you have, but I guess we can. How much more time do you have? I want to be mindful of your time.
I can probably go for about 15, 20 more minutes, right around. But if the conversation is coming to an end as well, I mean.
Sure. And okay, we
this has been a good long talk, I think.
I guess like if you wanted to elaborate more on sin and suffering, because like I remember I think it said in scripture that like if you eat from the tree of knowledge, lest you become like me, and that's what God said, right?
Lest you die. I think he says lest you die, but lest you become like me. Maybe that's the eventuality. But and I guess I'll reiterate. The prior point is that if sin is the birth of suffering, that's from the right. And so, I mean, obviously, the Christian conception is original sin, that everyone is responsible for that sin, or that everyone carries that sin, and so then there's a redemption of all sin. But that isn't necessarily the Jewish or the Islamic conception, but rather that there is a fall. Right? Obviously, there's a shattering and there's a separation from God, and really that's what that means is sin is sort of a separation from God, and then when we look at this sort of expansive history, I think I forget his name, but a postmodernist, he says that, I think it's John Leotard, where he says that history is the process of man trying to become God. And if we look at the sin, the fall as a separation from God, then human history is just the attempt to return to God. Right? If you have been exiled, there's necessarily an idea of a return that emerges, right? And this is the beautiful thing about Judaism, is that there are all these marvelous paradoxes of opposites, and that's why it's very Hegelian, actually. And so I'm obviously Hegel pulls from Christianity, and so all these same ideas are present there, but there's this idea that loss will eventually lead to gain, that blindness will lead to sight, that exile will lead to return, that death will lead to life. Right? And darkness will lead to light, suffering will lead to glory, humility will lead to exaltation. And so what's going on? We have like the opposites converging, right? And we have the universal and the particular meeting each other, God, right? So, and that's really what that is. It's that, we have been separated and there's a desire to return, right? And one of the Jewish conceptions, the Orthodox idea, is a clinging to God, a clinging to the moral covenant and all these things. But if we recognize sin in the sense that in a way of understanding a separation from God, then we sort of understand living a life of not sinning and sinning in a very broad sense. I understand it gets very dogmatic very quickly, but living life because most sin, I mean, like the very explicit conception of sin is very, I mean, it's something that all people agree with, right? You shall not murder. Who thinks murder is good? Who thinks adultery is good, right? Betrayal of a relationship or betrayal of a commitment, right? None of these things, stealing, lying, like we all agree fundamentally that that these are wrong. If we live in a way that we don't do these things, then we respect our commitments, and we respect other people, then we won't murder, we won't adultery, we won't lie, we won't steal. We will live a life that is aligned, and so if we live that life, perhaps it is a representation of fully acknowledging the dignity of every other human being, the dignity of the agency of their life. And so in that way, perhaps that if we don't sin, we can reduce suffering maybe as well, but sin as the birth of suffering, as the beginning of suffering, and then suffering as a necessary existential part of life that is part of this expansive process of returning to God. And that's why I really like that message, because that's the Jewish message too. It's that, and it's something that is like that all people can resonate with, that we all have suffering in our life, we all have these problems that we go through, but that there will eventually be a redemption for those things, that there is a meaning or a purpose for them, and perhaps not maybe in this world, but in maybe in another world, right? But that even in the bleakest of situations, and this is what I love about Search for Meaning, right? Even in the bleakest of situations, when you're in hell, that there is a virtue in being virtuous. Right? There is a virtue in holding on to your. There is a virtue in standing firm, and that's something that can't be taken away, and that's something transcendentally beautiful. And obviously that is, and in a way that's redemptive too. And is there such a thing as redemption without suffering? Is there such a thing as return without exile? Is there such a thing, right? And so, and when painted in that way, perhaps we have to recognize that this sort of dialectic is our human existence. And so that's my sort of my perspective on God, my perspective on the book, my perspective on really nihilism and sort of existence as a whole is a reconciliation of opposites. And the greatest opposite is man and God. And this is where the Christian idea really comes in. It's that, well, here you have man coming into God, or God coming into man. You have the particular the universal going into the particular, right? And so you have this beautiful consummation of all these ideas, and it's remarkable, really. Absolutely remarkable. So yeah,
it's thank you so much for your time. Maybe we might plan to talk about. I was thinking about diving more into getting into the dynamics of redemption, the afterlife.
Yeah, that'd be an awesome concept.
What does it mean to be reborn? And
that's a great idea.
The image of Christ or God, and what is maybe another time we can get into that. I really appreciate your time.
I really appreciate it too. This was great. I appreciate you doing this. I appreciate giving me a place to talk. I mean, I appreciate learning from you and hearing cognitive models and all these things. And
I do.
Knowledge. I mean, it's great.
I'm thinking about making a theology focused paper.
I think that'd be remarkable.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll have another dialogue. Great.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys.
All right. Take it easy.
All right. See you, Jesse.